Okay, part 4. There's no adequate margin of safety to protect everyone from known harmful effects of fluoride. This report here is the National Research Council report, which was published in 2006, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency asked the National Research Council to look at whether or not their safe drinking water standard of 4 parts per million was actually safe, or whether they need to do anything about that. They thought they were only going to take a year. They took 3.5 years to produce this 507-page document with 1,100 references. The remarkable thing about this document is that this is the first time a review of fluoride in the United States has been conducted by a truly balanced panel. They normally select rubber stamp panels like you do with the National Health and Medical Research Council. These people are selected to produce a rubber stamp for Australian policy. But in this case, they had people on this panel that were pro-fluoridation, people that were anti-fluoridation, and most of them had never taken a position. And I was happy to give testimony in person to this panel. Now, what did they say? That fluoride, again, notice I've used the word fluoride, not fluoridation yet, but fluoride causes dental fluorosis, brain damage, a lowered thyroid function, accumulation of the pineal gland, bone damage, osteosarcoma, that's a rare bone cancer, but it could be killing young men, and finally that some people are very sensitive to very low levels of fluoride, justifying what you heard from Philip. It wasn't proved, but it was certainly a very distinct and plausible possibility. Incidentally, it's what you expect. Any toxic substance has a normal distribution curve of response. It's a bell-shaped curve. One end of the bell-shaped curve, you expect to find a few people that are very resistant to a toxic substance. And at the other end of the bell-shaped curve, you expect a few percent, maybe 1 or 2%, to be very sensitive to the toxic substance. And most people are somewhere in the middle, the average response. So the notion that there's a small percentage of the public that is very sensitive to fluoride is absolutely what you would expect. But it's not being investigated in Australia, except for heroes like Philip. Okay, so let's talk about dental fluorosis. When the early promoters started fluoridation, they thought at 1 part per million fluoride they could limit dental fluorosis, and I'm going to show you pictures in a moment, to 10% of children in its very mild form. What's the reality today? That same study that looked at tooth decay in 39,000 children also looked at dental fluorosis. And in the fluoridated communities in the United States, 30% of kids had dental fluorosis, 3 times more than they expected. And when you look at the different categories, 22.5% were in the very mild, where they expected 10%, and 5.8% in the mild, where they expected 0. In fact, the father of fluoridation, H. Trenley Dean, that did all the research in the 40s leading up to it, in cross-examination in the US Congress, said that mild dental fluorosis was an unacceptable trade-off. He did not accept mild dental fluorosis as a trade-off for reducing tooth decay. And that was the guy that started it all. And then in addition to that, you've got 1 in 100 that are getting moderate dental fluorosis. But note those names. Very mild, mild, and moderate. Let's see what they look like. This is very mild. This, at one range, is little white specks, blotches at the edge of the cusp of the teeth, but it can go up to 25% of the tooth surface. And there's mild. Mild goes up to 50% of the tooth surface. And that starts white, but it gets discolored with time, yellow, brown, orange. And then moderate. Look at that. That's supposed to be moderate. 100% of the tooth surface impacted, with discoloration, with indentations. And I've had students in my class with teeth like that, and they say when they go out on a date, they don't smile, They try to minimize their conversation because they don't want their boyfriend to see what the teeth are like, because the assumption is that they're a slob. That's psychological damage, staring you in the face with a young teenager. They daren't smile. And she said to me, I'd love to get this covered up, but it would cost me $12,000 to do it. I can't afford $12,000, and nor can my parents. And I don't know of any authority that's forcing fluoridation on communities, coming out and then paying for those poor people, the poor 1% or so, that get this condition, to pay for those veneers or that treatment. They're just left to sink or swim. You're just one of the unlucky ones. Now, as a result of this report, the National Research Council report, and also another study that came out of Iowa, which showed it was the first year of exposure to fluoride, which was the highest risk for developing dental fluorosis, triggered the American Dental Association to send this e-gram to their membership, to the dentists. If using, this is the advice that they recommended to patients, if using a product that needs to be reconstituted, they're talking about solid baby formula here, parents and caregivers should consider using water that has no or low levels of fluoride. That was the advice. But they didn't get it to parents. And in Australia, once again, those wonderful health authorities of yours said, this is not relevant to Australia because the problem in America is we have too much fluoride in the formula itself. Absolutely baloney. That is a pure fabrication, a pure public relations fabrication. We don't have any more fluoride in our baby formula than you do, and this recommendation was all about the fluoride in the water that you add to it. So in other words, the case in America and Australia is exactly the same. But the parents are not being warned. Even today, parents are not being warned. And when we a few days ago tried to get legislation in the state of New Hampshire, where our campaign manager is based, we tried to get this legislation in which would require this warning on the water bills of communities that were fluoridated. And I would recommend, as an interim measure in Mildura, whilst you're waiting to get rid of fluoridation completely, forever, amen, amen, get rid of it, whilst you're waiting, make sure the water company puts this warning in your water bills that parents should not use tap water to make up baby formula. So we tried to get that legislation into the New Hampshire law. And guess what? The American Dental Association did everything they possibly could to prevent this from happening. And yet it's the same advice that they were giving to dentists. But we were not allowed to give it to parents, and they squashed the bill. They squashed the bill. And like so many other atrocious things that are happening here, the only rational explanation for such irrational behavior is that these people are today much more concerned about protecting this practice of water fluoridation than protecting the health of the people. Why else? Why else would they stop us putting a warning in that they themselves have given to dentists? Because they believe that once parents hear this information, they might ask questions about whether water fluoridation should continue. And we don't want them to ask those questions, so we don't let the public know about this. We don't warn them. I mean, this is, again, outrageous. Now, the figures I gave you for dental fluorosis were from 1986, 87. We've now got these figures updated. And these now, this is a few weeks ago, and these are for all children in the United States, not just the kids in the fluoridated communities, but all kids, all American kids, aged 12 to 15. Kids aged 12 to 15, dental fluorosis, very mild, has gone from 17% to 28%. Mild has gone from 4% to 8.6%, and moderate and severe has gone up to 3.6%. Overall, 41% of all American children now have dental fluorosis, which is an indicator that they have been overexposed to fluoride before their permanent teeth have erupted. Consequences: on January the 7th, the Department of Health and Human Services announced that they're going to lower the optimal level from 1.2 parts per million to 0.7 parts per million because of these concerns about dental fluorosis. Straight away, what did your Australian authorities say? Doesn't relate to us. That's America. And then on January the 10th, something even more remarkable happened. The pesticide division of the EPA gave my wife a magnificent victory. She has led the charge in our group to stop Dow AgriSciences using sulfurofluoride as a fumigant on food, because it leaves a nasty residue of fluoride in foodstuffs, including a permitted level of 120 parts per million on wheat flour, which goes into everything from pizzas to bread to cookies and so on, 120 parts per million. And we argued you can't permit this because our kids are already being overexposed to fluoride, and this is only going to increase that. You can't do this. And they said, on the morning they said, we accept all of the Fluoride Action Network's objections, and we're going to phase out the use of sulfurofluoride over the next 3 years because we're over the limit for American children. They can't take any more. And what does your Australian government do? Nothing. They are continuing to use sulfurofluoride on foodstuffs, and you don't even have any standards. At least in the United States, Dow had to say what levels were acceptable on these different foods. You don't have that. They're just using sulfurofluoride willy-nilly, and nobody knows. Like everything else in Australia, nobody knows. Nobody knows what the dental fluorosis figures are. Nobody knows what the sulfurofluoride residue of fluoride levels are left on the food. But the key question for all of us is, when fluoride is damaging the baby's growing tooth cells, and that's the only thing they're concerned about, teeth, 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 the rest of us are concerned about brains, bones, thyroid glands. What's it doing to these other developing tissues which you can't see? You can see the teeth damage, you can't see the other. And one of the things I'm concerned about is babies, because the blood-brain barrier is not fully developed when the baby is born, we believe, and the baby should not be exposed to fluoride up to 250 times the level of fluoride that occurs in mother's milk, whatever Dr. Robert Hall believes. And this is what Arvid Carlsson said. Arvid Carlsson won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2000. He also led the successful campaign against fluoridation in Sweden. And he said in 1978, one wonders what an increase in the exposure to fluoride, such as occurs in bottle-fed infants, may mean for the development of the brain and other organs. Pretty prophetic, because the National Research Council said it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain. And we now have over 100 animal experiments that shows that fluoride can get into the brain, can concentrate in the brain, and cause all kinds of disruption on mental development. Well, this is one of those studies. They gave rats 1 part per million fluoride in their drinking water for 1 year. That's the same level as we get, either as aluminium fluoride, or sodium fluoride. With both groups of animals had kidney damage, brain damage, greater uptake of aluminium into the brain, and beta-amyloid deposits, which are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. So fluoride may be damaging our brains at both ends of our lives, with our babies and with our elderly people, and possibly for the same reason, that both when you're very young and you're very old, the blood-brain barrier may not be as effective as it should be at keeping out toxics. Human studies. There have now been 24 published studies from China, India, Iran, and Mexico indicating a lowering of IQ associated with moderate exposure to fluoride. They're all listed on our webpage and also in our book. This is the study that I was most interested in because I had the opportunity to go to China and visit these two villages. The remarkable thing about these two villages is the populations have been stable for over hundreds of years. They all have the same housing, the same occupation. They're all rural farmers, the same diet, the same rural diet, the same educational level. So everything seems to be the same, except that they have different levels of fluoride in their water. And they did also control for lead and iodine, both of which can interfere with IQ. But there was a 5 to 10 IQ point drop across the whole age range in the village at 2.5 to 4.5 parts per million, and the village less than 0.7. In the village, the higher fluoride village, there were less very bright kids and more mentally handicapped kids. The whole curve of IQ was shifted over. And Zhang estimates that this IQ would be lowered at 1.9 parts per million. 1.9. Now, this is where we have to argue the margin of safety. If fluoride is associated with a lowering of IQ of children at 1.9 parts per million in a small population study, there's only 300 kids in that village, we need to apply a safety factor when we're trying to protect the whole population of Australia or America. And why is that? Well, you've got 300 kids, they're the same, essentially the same genetic, Chinese children, same ethnic group, same most of the things. Whereas when you take the whole population of Australia, you've got different ethnic groups, you have different dietary things, you have many different things. And normally what we do when we're extrapolating from a small study to protect the whole population, we have a safety factor of 10. That's what we normally do. We assume that some kids are going to be 10 times more sensitive in our whole population than one of those kids in the small population. Okay? So now I'm going to make a simple assumption. I'm going to assume that those Chinese kids were drinking 1 liter of water a day to make the arithmetic simple. Okay, so at 1.9 milligrams per liter, if they're drinking 1 liter, they're getting 1.9 milligrams per day. All right? Now let's divide that by 10. 1.9 divided by 10 is 0.19 milligrams per day. So to protect all the children of Australia or America from lowering of IQ, we wouldn't want them to get more than 0.19 milligrams per day, and that's less than 1 whole glass of water. That's what I mean about there not being adequate margin of safety. To continue fluoridation with these kind of studies, and this isn't one, this is 24 studies now. To continue fluoridation with that on the table is utterly reckless. Utterly reckless. And remember, the best you've done in Australia is a saving of 0.3 of 1 tooth surface. So why would you continue a practice aimed at reducing tooth decay by 0.3 of 1 tooth surface when in fact we've got a result which suggests that drinking 1 glass of water may lower the IQ of your children? It's insane. And I defy anybody to tell me that it's not insane. And now, thank God, we've got all of this documented. Everything I've been telling you tonight is documented here. There's 80 pages of references. And I said to my wife, when this finally got published, I said to her, it feels like I've been constipated for 14 years and they've just let me have a crap. And she said, for goodness sake, don't say that. They're going to assume this book is a load of you-know-what, but no. She told me not to say it, and I say it everywhere. But it's all documented. So now, it's up to them to come back with a scientific response. Fluoride in the thyroid. Several lines of information indicate an effect of fluoride exposure on thyroid function, especially when people have borderline iodine deficiency, and that's one of the problems in Australia. You don't have enough iodine. A lot of people are borderline iodine deficient. Some of you are outright iodine deficient. The last thing you need to be exposed to is fluoride. Doctors in Europe in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s used to treat patients with fluoride tablets to lower the activity of the thyroid gland of people with hyperthyroidism. Lowered the function. And in the Ukraine, Bajinsky and co-workers found that thyroid function could be lowered at 2.3 parts per million in the drinking water. Again, no margin of safety. There's only about 100 people in that study. No margin of safety for lowered thyroid function. And what have you got in Australia? You've got millions of people with hyperthyroidism. In America, we have between 20 and 40 million Americans with hyperthyroidism, and nobody in any single fluoridated country has set out to investigate if those people with hyperthyroidism, which incidentally overlap with the people that are sensitive to fluoride, the symptoms, there's quite a correspondence to those symptoms. So it may be that the people that are really sensitive to fluoride have a lowered thyroid, they're already borderline thyroid function. But they're not being investigated. But if fluoride is associated with the lowering of IQ, oh sorry, I've gone through that. If fluoride lowers thyroid function, it could explain the delayed eruption of the teeth I was talking about. It would explain lowered IQ in children, and it would explain the increase in hyperthyroidism among US population, plus the symptoms. The symptoms are depression, lethargy, tiredness not relieved by sleep, and obesity. And again, nobody in Australia is investigating if that is caused by fluoride or exacerbated by fluoride. Fluoride in the bone. The first symptoms of fluoride's poisoning of the bone, well established in India and China, are stiffness of joints. Stiffness of joints. And then pains in the joints and pains in the bone. And pains in the muscles. And we now have 1 in 3 Americans with arthritis. And if you ask your doctor, Doc, what causes arthritis? They say, we don't really know, but we think it's got something to do with aging. And what does aging have to do with in Australia? It may have something to do with how many years you've spent drinking fluoridated water. But again, no one's investigating a possible connection with arthritis and fluoridation. Even though, incidentally, the National Health and Medical Research Council in 1991 recommended that health agencies in Australia measure fluoride levels in the bone so that they could look at a possible relationship with various bone diseases, osteoporosis, arthritis, and bone fractures. Haven't done it in 20 years. Fluoride can make bones more brittle. This is the bone that we're most concerned about. This is the bone where the hip joins the pelvis. When that bone breaks, it can be very, very serious for an elderly person. They have to be immobilized for many weeks, in which time the muscles atrophy. And being old, they can't exercise like young people. And half those people never regain an independent existence, and a quarter are dead within a year. So if fluoride is contributing, that is very serious. Over to China again. There's a study done by Americans in China, same approach. All these villages, everything's the same except the level of fluoride in the water. And what they found was between 1.5 and 3.5 parts per million, the hip fracture rates approximately doubled compared to the village at 1 part per million. And that when you got to levels over 4.3 parts per million, the rate of hip fractures tripled. And that was statistically significant. Now it's interesting to see how the proponents and opponents of fluoridation treat the same data. The proponents of fluoridation say there's only one point that you have to be concerned here, and that is with village 6, because that's the only one that's statistically significant. So for them, it's a threshold. Nothing happens to hip fracture rates until you hit 4.3 parts per million, or the dose associated with people drinking that level. And all of a sudden, the hip fracture rates triple. The opponents of fluoridation say, we think we see a trend here. This looks like a trend to us. It looks like a trend. And although these are not statistically significant points, they may be real points. You can have real data which doesn't show up as statistically significant. You may not have had enough people in your study, but it looks like a real trend. In which case, if that is correct, if the latter explanation is correct, we have a long discussion of this in our book, then hip fractures could increase as little as 3 milligrams a day. 3 milligrams a day. And those miners in Western Australia are, they will reach the levels of village 6 or close. So all of a sudden, in their 50s, they're going to find themselves with a hip fracture. But no one's warning them. Fluoride may cause bone cancer. This is important because this indicates that fluoridation may actually be killing not a lot of people, but a few people. And again, is it worth killing a few people just to save 0.3 of a tooth surface? And it's also important because it introduces how politics interfere with science. Well, first of all, the science. In 2001, a dentist doing research at Harvard Dental School defended her doctoral thesis, which showed that if young boys, not young girls, if young boys were exposed to fluoridated water in their 6th, 7th, or 8th years, they had a 5 to 7-fold increased risk of succumbing to osteosarcoma by the age of 20. And she was the first person to look at a window of vulnerability, looking at this as a function not of how much fluoride they were exposed to, but when they were exposed to fluoride. And this 6th, 7th, and 8th years corresponds to the mid-childhood bone growth spurt, when the bones are turning over. And when the tissue is turning over rapidly, that's when they're more vulnerable to genetic damage and the beginning of cancer. Now, let's have the politics. Her advisor at the dental school was Chester Douglas. And Chester Douglas is pro-fluoridation and is a consultant for Colgate, which has some interest in this matter. And he had 3 opportunities between 2001 and 2005 to tell his peers and the regulatory agencies and his funder that his graduate student had found this result, that water fluoridation may actually be killing a few people. And he didn't do it. In 2002, he went to England and talked to the British Fluoridation Society and said, my work shows no relationship between osteosarcoma and fluoridation. He just forgot to tell them that his graduate student, whose thesis he had signed, had found that relationship, but didn't tell him. And then when he was asked by the National Research Council to send in a statement of his work, he again said, my work shows no relationship between osteosarcoma and fluoridation. This time he put Bassin's thesis as a footnote, but he didn't explain in his submission that that footnote contradicted what he was telling them. Didn't tell them. They would have had to take a plane from Washington, D.C. to Boston and gone to a rare book section of one of the Harvard medical libraries before they found this PhD thesis, which my son did. My son found, acting on a tip-off, he went to that library in 2005. He found the thesis, the chapter which describes this. He then got that chapter to the National Research Council, and we also got it to the media, to the Wall Street Journal, who exposed these shenanigans from Chester Douglas. But you have to wonder why it is that the National Institute of Health should spend over $1 million funding a study from a dental school to see if fluoridation is killing people. I mean, didn't they think there was any kind of conflict of interest going on there? Anyway, Bassin finally published her study in the May of 2006 with her husband and 2 other professors from Harvard. And on the same issue of the journal, Chester Douglas, puts in a letter telling people not to take this result too seriously because his larger study refuted her findings. And then he promised his study would appear in the summer of 2006. And we are still waiting. We are waiting for Chester Goddo Douglas. He has since retired. That doesn't mean the paper's not going to come out. But meanwhile, the pro-fluoridation agencies in Canada, in England, and in Australia are using Douglas's promise, which is not peer-reviewed and not published, to negate Bassen's findings, which is what the National Health and Medical Research Council did in 2007, which is politics, not science. In fact, here is the NHMRC. David McRae wrote to the National Health and Medical Research Council when he heard that they were coming out with a review of fluoridation and said, please carefully review these 507 pages from the National Research Council. The best study on fluoride that's ever been in print. And they dismissed, the National Health and Medical Research Council dismissed this whole report in one sentence. They said it wasn't relevant to Australia. It's crap. Of course it's relevant to Australia. They said, oh, it's because they looked at fluoridation at 4 parts per million. Nonsense. If you look through here, there's many studies less than 4 parts per million. But it's still absolutely atrocious because it means they don't even understand a basic tenet of toxicology. Concentration is not the dose. Somebody drinking 4 liters of water at 1 part per million would get 4 milligrams per day. Somebody drinking 1 liter of water at 4 parts per million would get 4 milligrams per day. So you can't say that because a study was done at 4 parts per million, it's not relevant to people at 1 part per million. It depends how much water they're drinking. And to chuck this whole report out based upon that wonky assumption, again, illustrates politics, not science. Again, it underlines that for some people, including the Australian government, and the NHMRC is part of the Australian government, that protecting this policy is more important than protecting the health of the Australian people. They used Douglas' promise of a study to dismiss Bassen's findings. Much of their review was a straight copy of huge chunks of the York Review. So they went back to 2000 for the York Review instead of using the superior information, the more recent information from the National Research Council of the United States. Okay, part 4. There's no adequate margin of safety to protect everyone from known harmful effects of fluoride. This report here is the National Research Council report, which was published in 2006, and the US Environmental Protection Agency asked the National Research Council to look at whether or not their safe drinking water standard of 4 parts per million was actually safe, or whether they need to do anything about that. They thought they were only going to take a year. They took 3.5 years to produce this 507-page document with 1,100 references. The remarkable thing about this document is that this is the first time a review of fluoride in the United States has been conducted by a truly balanced panel. They normally select rubber stamp panels like you do with the National Health and Medical Research Council. These P4OSIS in as a trade-off for reducing tooth decay. And that was the guy that started it all. And then in addition to that, you've got 1 in 100 that are getting moderate dental fluorosis. But note those names. Very mild, mild, and moderate. Let's see what they look like. This is very mild. This, at one range, is little white specks, blotches at the edge of the cusp of the teeth, but it can go up to 25% of the tooth surface. And there's mild. Mild goes up to 50% of the tooth surface. And that starts white, but it gets discolored with time, yellow, brown, orange. And then moderate. Look at that. That's supposed to be moderate. 100% of the tooth surface impacted, with discoloration, with indentations. And I've had students in my class with teeth like that, and they say when they go out on a date, they don't smile. They are selected to produce a rubber stamp for Australian policy. But in this case, they had people on this panel that were pro-fluoridation, people that were anti-fluoridation, and most of them had never taken a position. And I was happy to give testimony in person to this panel. Now, what did they say? That fluoride, again, notice I've used the word fluoride, not fluoridation yet, but fluoride causes dental fluorosis, brain damage, lowered thyroid function, accumulation of the pineal gland, bone damage, osteosarcoma, that's a rare bone cancer, but it could be killing young men, and finally that some people are very sensitive to very low levels of fluoride, justifying what you heard from Philip. It wasn't proved, but it was certainly a very distinct and plausible possibility. Incidentally, it's what you expect. Any toxic substance has a normal distribution curve of response. It's a bell-shaped curve. One end of the bell-shaped curve, you expect to find a few people that are very resistant to a toxic substance. And at the other end of the bell-shaped curve, you expect a few percent, maybe 1 or 2%, to be very sensitive to the toxic substance. And most people are somewhere in the middle, the average response. So the notion that there's a small percentage of the public that is very sensitive to fluoride is absolutely what you would expect. But it's not being investigated in Australia, except for heroes like Philip. Okay, so let's talk about dental fluorosis. When the early promoters started fluoridation, they thought at 1 part per million fluoride they could limit dental fluorosis, and I'm going to show you pictures in a moment, to 10% of children in its very mild form. What's the reality today? That same study that looked at tooth decay in 39,000 children also looked at dental fluorosis. And in the fluoridated communities in the United States, 30% of kids had dental fluorosis, 3 times more than they expected. And when you look at the different categories, 22.5% were in the very mild, where they expected 10%, and 5.8% in the mild, where they expected 0. In fact, the father of fluoridation, H. Trenley Dean, that did all the research in the 40s leading up to it, in cross-examination in the US Congress, said that mild dental fluorosis was an unacceptable trade-off. He did not accept mild dental